It doesn't make sense at first. Saving the first $10,000 feels like trying to push a car uphill with one hand, while going from $10,000 to $100,000 somehow starts to feel manageable. Not easy, but different. Lighter. Like something shifted behind the scenes, and that's where most people get it wrong. Because on paper, $100,000 is 10 times bigger, 10 times the distance, 10 times the effort, right? But in reality, it doesn't feel that way at all. The real question isn't how much money is being saved. The real question is why the experience of saving changes so dramatically along the way. At the beginning, every dollar feels like a sacrifice. Every decision feels heavy. There's this constant tension between what's needed right now and what's supposed to be saved for later. Picture someone earning a modest income. Rent takes a huge cut. Groceries, transportation, insurance, phone bills. Those don't wait. They don't negotiate. By the time the essentials are covered, what's left might be a few $100s. That leftover amount isn't just for savings. It has to cover everything else life throws in. A dinner out, a birthday gift, new shoes when the old ones fall apart, and then, somewhere in that shrinking margin, there's this expectation to save. So maybe $300 goes into savings one month. It feels like progress. It feels like finally moving forward. Then something breaks. A car repair shows up out of nowhere. $800 gone in a second. Just like that, 3 months of effort disappears. The balance drops back down almost to where it started. And that's not just a financial reset, that's emotional. Because it starts to feel like no matter what happens, the number refuses to grow. Like progress is temporary, but setbacks are permanent. That cycle doesn't just drain money, it drains belief. And here's the part that rarely gets said clearly. That struggle isn't just about discipline. It's not about being bad with money. It's about math. At low balances, money behaves differently. When savings are close to zero, every expense hits harder because there's no buffer. There's no cushion to absorb the shock. Every unexpected cost becomes a full reset instead of a small dip. And it gets worse. The less money available, the more expensive life becomes. Cheap products break faster, which means replacing them more often. Missing a bill by a few days leads to late fees. Needing quick cash leads to high interest options that take more than they give. It's not that bad decisions are being made. It's that the available options are more expensive by default. So even when everything is done right, the system itself makes progress slower. Now compare that to someone who already has $100,000 saved. At a 5% annual return, that money generates $5,000 a year. That's about $416 every single month. No extra work, no extra effort, just sitting there. Meanwhile, someone with $300 saved might earn a few dollars in an entire year. That's not just a small difference, that's a completely different system. At the bottom, effort creates progress. At higher levels, money starts creating progress on its own. That's the shift, but before that shift happens, there's another layer working quietly in the background. The mental side. When money is tight, the brain doesn't get to rest. Every purchase turns into a calculation. Every decision carries weight. There's this constant checking whether the account balance can handle it, whether the next paycheck will be enough, whether something unexpected is about to happen again. That kind of pressure doesn't just feel stressful, it consumes mental energy. And that energy is the same thing needed to plan ahead, to stay consistent, to make better long-term decisions. So even when two people face the same choice, the one under financial pressure is already operating at a disadvantage. Not because of intelligence, but because of cognitive load. Now imagine two different situations. One person has $80 in savings. Another has $80,000. They both face a financial decision. Statistically, the person with $80,000 is more likely to make the better choice. Not because they're smarter, because their mind isn't already overloaded. That's the hidden cost of starting from zero. It's not just about money being low. It's about everything becoming heavier at the same time. And this is why the early phase feels so slow. It's not just the numbers moving slowly, it's everything working against forward momentum at once. Low margin, high risk, minimal returns, constant pressure. And then something interesting happens around the $10,000 mark. It's not dramatic. There's no big moment where everything suddenly changes overnight. But quietly, things start to shift. That same $800 car repair no longer resets everything. It just reduces the balance. Instead of going back to the beginning, there's still something left. That changes behavior. Decisions start to stretch a little further into the future. There's less panic, less urgency. For the first time, it stops feeling like constant defense and starts to feel like the beginning of offense. That doesn't mean it's easy, it just means it's different. Because now there's a buffer, and that buffer removes some of the expensive traps that existed before. No more late fees from barely missing a payment. No more forced bad decisions because there's no alternative. And slowly, almost without noticing, the system that was working against progress starts to ease up. Now think about the numbers again. At $10,000, a 7% return generates $700 in a year. That's not life-changing, but it's visible. It's enough to notice. At $50,000, that same return becomes $3,500 a year. Now it's meaningful. At $100,000, it becomes $7,000 annually. That's where things start to feel different. Because now, growth isn't coming only from effort. It's coming from the system itself. And this is where the emotional experience changes. Not because discipline suddenly increases, but because the math finally starts cooperating. To understand this more clearly, imagine a simple timeline. Two people start at zero. Both save the same amount every month. The first stretch, from $0 to $10,000, takes years. Slow, inconsistent, full of setbacks. Then the next stretch, from $10,000 to $100,000, while still requiring time, starts to compress. Because part of the growth is no longer coming from contributions, it's coming from compounding. At the beginning, almost 100% of the money comes from effort. Every dollar in the account was placed there manually. But as the balance grows, that ratio changes. At $100,000, a noticeable portion of growth comes from returns. And over time, that portion keeps increasing. Eventually, the growth from money itself starts rivaling the growth from effort. That's when it feels like things are speeding up. But here's the problem. Most people never reach that point. Not because they aren't capable, but because the early phase convinces them it's not working. Imagine a simple story. Two people start the same journey. Both commit to saving consistently. Both go through the same early struggles, the same setbacks, the same slow progress. They both reach $8,000. At that point, it still feels hard, still feels slow, still feels like a lot of effort for not much visible reward. One of them stops, not out of laziness, but because it feels like the system isn't responding, like all that effort isn't producing enough return. So the decision is made to pause, maybe to come back later. The other keeps going, pushes through the same resistance, eventually reaches $10,000, and something small but important changes. Setbacks hurt less. Progress sticks longer. The number doesn't collapse back to zero anymore. That creates momentum. From there, the climb continues. $20,000, $30,000. Each step still requires effort. But now, something else is helping. By the time $100,000 is reached, the experience is completely different. Because now, growth happens even during periods of rest. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth. The difference between those two outcomes wasn't intelligence. It wasn't income, at least not entirely. It was staying in the system long enough for the math to change. That's it. And that's why the first $10,000 feels so much harder than the path that comes after. Because during that phase, there's no visible support from the system, no reinforcement, no acceleration, just effort, and delayed feedback, which is one of the hardest environments to stay consistent in. There's another way to see this. Think of saving like planting something. At the beginning, everything goes into the soil. Time, effort, patience. But nothing shows above the surface. Days pass, weeks pass. It looks like nothing is happening. That's the $0 to $10,000 phase. Then eventually, something breaks through. A small sign that progress exists. That's around $10,000. After that, growth becomes more visible, more consistent, and eventually, it starts feeding itself. That's the move toward $100,000. But if the process is stopped before anything appears above the surface, it's easy to assume it wasn't working. Even when it was. That's the risk. Quitting before compounding wakes up, because compounding doesn't feel powerful at the beginning. It feels invisible, and invisible progress is the easiest kind to abandon. Now bring this back to the core question. Why does early saving feel impossibly slow, then suddenly faster? Because in the beginning, progress depends entirely on effort. Later, progress is shared between effort and math doesn't get tired. Math doesn't lose motivation. Math just keeps going. But it only starts contributing in a meaningful way after enough time and consistency have built a foundation. And that foundation is what the first $10,000 represents. Not just a number, but a transition point. From pure effort to assisted growth. And that's why the emotional experience changes so much. Not because the goal becomes smaller, but because the system finally starts helping. Now take that same idea and stretch it out over time. Picture a simple graph. The horizontal axis is time. The vertical axis is money. At the very beginning, the line barely moves. It crawls forward, almost flat. Every month adds a little, but visually, it looks like nothing is happening. That's the first phase, from $0 to $10,000. Years can pass in that section, depending on income and savings rate. And even with consistency, the line doesn't impress. It doesn't feel rewarding. It doesn't give that sense of momentum people expect when effort is being put in. Now something subtle happens as the line moves past $10,000. It starts to curve, not sharply at first, just slightly. But that slight curve is everything, because that curve represents a shift in where growth is coming from. At the beginning of the graph, nearly every dollar comes from contributions. That means time is traded directly for progress. No contribution means no growth. So if $500 is saved in a month, the account grows by $500. That's it. But as the balance increases, something else starts contributing quietly in the background. Returns. At $10,000, a 7% annual return adds around $700 per year. That breaks down to roughly $58 per month. Now imagine still contributing $500 monthly. The total growth isn't $500 anymore. It's $558. That difference seems small, almost irrelevant. But it doesn't stay small. At $25,000, that same return generates around $1,750 per year. Now the monthly boost is about $145. So $500 turns into $645. At $50,000, returns add about $3,500 annually. Now monthly growth increases by roughly $290. So the same effort produces $790. And then at $100,000, something interesting happens. That 7% return becomes $7,000 a year, around $583 per month, which means the account is now growing faster from returns alone than what was originally being contributed in the early stages. That's the moment everything starts to feel different, because now, even without increasing effort, the results accelerate. And this is the part that's hard to feel in the beginning, because the difference between $500 and $558 doesn't feel like momentum, but the difference between $500 and $1,083 absolutely does. Same system, same percentage, completely different experience. That's compounding. Not just as a concept, but as something that can actually be felt. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Look at the composition of the total amount over time. In the early phase, almost 100% of the account is made up of contributions. Every dollar has a clear origin. It was saved manually. But as time goes on, that ratio starts to shift. At $100,000, a noticeable portion of that total isn't from effort anymore. It's from growth. And if time continues, that portion keeps expanding. Eventually, contributions become the smaller part of the equation, and returns become the dominant force. That's when the system fully flips, from effort-driven to momentum-driven. But again, that only happens if the early phase is survived. Now bring back the story. Two people, same starting point, same income, same intention, both begin saving. The early months feel identical, tight margins, careful decisions, occasional setbacks. Saving your first $10,000 feels slow because every dollar comes from effort, and setbacks can erase months of progress. Early on, expenses are high, margins are thin, and returns are almost invisible, making it feel like nothing is working. Meanwhile, reaching $100,000 feels different because the system starts helping. Returns become noticeable, setbacks hurt less, and growth continues even without constant effort. The shift isn't just financial, it's psychological. Saving stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like momentum. The real difference is simple. The first phase is driven by discipline, while the next is powered by compounding, where money begins to grow on its own. And that shift only happens for those who stay long enough to see it. That's the whole game. Stay long enough for the system to change. Because once it does, the journey doesn't just continue, it accelerates. And the part that once felt impossible starts to feel natural. That's when saving stops being something that has to be forced and becomes something that builds on its own. And that's when the path to $100,000 no longer feels like 10 times the effort. It feels like the moment everything finally started working. Now, if this perspective changed the way money and saving is viewed, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who's still in that early phase, because that's exactly where most people quit. Right before things start to move.